Okay, we want to finish up our talk on natural selection, then get into our new topic for this podcast. Natural selection we've been talking about, and but we mentioned that it is limited. Natural selection just plays upon traits that are there. It is not a creative force, uh, basically meaning that it just is horizontal movement, or it just manipulates existing traits. So the finches, we're just looking at traits that are already in the population. In the bacteria, we're looking at traits that are already in the population. Um, so this does not do any explanation for macroevolution, for explaining how a new trait could come into existence, how feathers could be created or produced out of from animals that did not have feathers. Things like that, where you had to have a completely new trait for these types of organisms. So natural selection doesn't really explain that at all. It's not a mechanism for explaining how new traits come into existence. It's just an explanation for explaining how traits become more dominant in a population or can be lost in a population. So that doesn't really help Darwin's theory of explaining how organisms move from less complex to more complex organisms. Now, Darwin didn't know anything about genetics because Mendel hadn't come around yet. And Mendel showed us basically that the genetic makeup of a population is stable, and we don't have new traits just popping in um, to that population. And those are his laws of segregation, is what he developed. But there is a theory about how a new trait could come into existence. And so this would be necessary for macroevolution to have um, happened. So we would have to have had new traits to come in if we're going to go from simple animals like invertebrates to more complex animals. We have to have new traits come in. And so this is the theory about how that happened. Of course, we're talking about historical evolution, this stuff that happened in the past. We've talked about evidence that's used to support it. But this is a stumbling block as far as how new traits could come into existence. So it attempted to incorporate ideas about how the genetic makeup of an individual could be manipulated through mutations, that mutations could happen to populations in the past, and these mutations would shuffle the genetic makeup, and out would come a new trait. And so that is the theory. Now, lots of study has gone into mutations and what they can they produce when we mess with the nucleotide sequence of genetics in organisms. This is an animal that's a model organism for studies of mutations. It's the Drosophila fruit fly. And in this animal, mutations have been produced on this animal, and you can see this animal has legs coming out of its head. So it messed with that genetic information related to its head and its legs, and out come an animal with legs coming out of its head. All right, so lots of studies like this with bacteria and these insects and things like that go into looking at what can a mutation actually do. Um, Now, generally, mutations are deleterious and they are harmful. They're even lethal. So most of the time, mutations are not good. You don't want mutations in your genetic makeup. So that's a bad thing. Again, the theory is that there was some mutations in the past that were beneficial. Now, whether we've produced any today through all these studies that have been beneficial, um, probably not. There is some that are maybe neutral. these fruit flies, there was some that were produced with 2 sets of wings instead of 1. So is that beneficial? Some say that's harmful because it can't fly as well. Um, so the mutation thing is a theory about how it happened in the past, and the theory is that over millions of years you'd have so many chances of billions of years, you'd have so many opportunities for this to occur that some would come out beneficial, and that benefit would then be acted upon by natural selection and select for that and then pass it on. So that's the theory, and that is the theory, and combining those to the study of genetics and mutations, and Darwin's theory about change over time is sometimes coined in the phrase neo-Darwinism. Here's the term right here. Neo refers to new Darwinism, because again, Darwin knew nothing about genetics, and so attempting to incorporate genetics into Darwin's theory is neo-Darwinism. All right, so that wraps up natural selection. Now we want to move into a new topic related to evolution, and that is the study of genetics, continuing on with genetics in populations and how these things change over time, very closely related to natural selection and how natural selection acts upon these populations. So we start with the definition as a population of a group of organisms belonging to the same species that live in a particular area. So again, a species is the ability, individuals that can produce and produce fertile offspring. So the study of the genetics in a population is the field of population genetics, and this is the basic unit for study of change over time. So when we look at genetics and we're looking at change over time, this is the unit. The population unit is where we look at that. And the collective genes in a population is called a gene pool. So a gene pool is a total collection of genes at any one time. Let's see. So mentioned that modern. So again, the modern synthesis, or sometimes called neo-Darwinism, is an attempt to connect Darwin's theory to the study of genetics. And again, the level of population is where we look at that. So our term microevolution, so again, we've thrown the two terms micro and macroevolution. Macro being that large-scale historical evolution that happened in the past. The theory is mutations drove it. Microevolution is just a change in the frequency. So that's a term geneticists use for ratio. So it's just a change in the ratio of genes in a gene pool. So if we have a change in the number of individuals with broad beaks in those finches, even if it's a small change, we refer to that as microevolution. In the human population, if we have individuals, say blue eye color, if we have 20% of people in the human population that have blue eye color. If next generation we have 19% of people that have blue eye color, then that has been a change in the frequency of these genes or alleles, and so that's considered microevolution. And we study that again at the population level. Now there's some things that help govern the study of these populations. And their principles called the Hardy-Weinberg principles or laws. And these researchers developed these ideas around the idea that a population will not change if certain conditions are met. All right, and by change, we're just talking about allelic frequency. All right, and so if you remember back from genetics, alleles are genes that have multiple traits in the population. All right, so and we can track allelic frequency from one generation to the next using these Hardy-Weinberg principles. This shows an example of a bird that has some individuals have webbed feet and some do not. The webbed foot is recessive. If you see that, the lowercase letter is representing recessive. Now, this individual has one dominant and one recessive allele. You remember back from genetics, this is heterozygous, this is homozygous recessive, this is homozygous dominant. So the dominant allele is non-web feet. So we can track these individuals. We are tracking 500 individuals. 320 of them have homozygous dominant. 160 are heterozygous dominant expression, and 20 of them are homozygous recessive, expressing the recessive trait. All right, so, but we want to get down even further, not just that's called the genotype. We want to get past the genotype, and we want to get to the allelic ratio or frequency. So the frequency of the genotypes is 64%, 32% have this, and 4% have that. All right, but we want to break down the dominant and recessive. So these 320 individuals each have 2 dominant alleles. That makes a total of 640 dominants. These 160 individuals each have 1 dominant and 1 recessive. That's 160 dominant and 160 recessive. These 20 individuals have 2 recessive alleles. That's 40. So we add the 40 plus the 160 recessive from this group, we get 200. We get the 640 and the 160 from this group, add those, we get 800. We got a total of 1,000 alleles because we got 500 individuals. They each have 2 alleles. So we divide that by 1,000. We get 80% dominant alleles and 20% recessive alleles. So that's the allelic frequency. And that's really what we do not, that's what does not change if there's no microevolution. So we have 80-20, and in the next generation, if we have 81-19, then we have had change in the allelic frequency. So any change in this at all results in microevolution. All right, and so that's what Hardy-Weinberg principles state, that we have this allelic frequency, and if it remains constant in the next generation, we've had no change and no allelic frequency. And what they said is that there is some certain conditions that if they're met, you can have that exact allelic frequency. We can also plug this into a Punnett square, if you remember that back from genetics. Punnett square, you just plug that in with the female alleles here and the male alleles up here, and it gives you that genotypic and allelic frequency. All right, so the condition that Hardy-Weinberg stated is that these are the conditions that have to be met in order for those frequencies to remain exactly the same. All right, and so we list these out, these allelic, these conditions. Sometimes stated in a couple of different ways, but basically the population has to be very large. There has to be no gene flow between the populations. Now, gene flow is migration of alleles in or out due to breeding, an individual coming in, breeding, and bringing their genes. No mutations, so we have to have no mutations in the genetic makeup, and we have to have random mating occurring, and then no natural selection. So this is a big one. There's different forms of natural selection we'll look at that can happen to the population, but basically we can state that this never happens. There's always some things occurring, natural selection one, that will cause the allelic frequency to change. All right, we're going to stop right there. We're going to pick back up, still looking at population genetics and how these play out, these laws, Hardy-Weinberg laws play out in the population in our next podcast.